right, I just want to say before I get started that I've been a member of this community for about 1.5 years now, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved because this has been really, really great. And thanks for putting together such a wonderful conference. I'm clearly really excited to be here today because I get to talk about something that I'm fairly passionate about, which is managing content. I've been really lucky in my career so far to get to do this at companies of different sizes, from being a lone technical writer up to, I currently work at Atlassian and we have hundreds or thousands of employees. And so what I've actually been doing recently is managing our developer documentation at Atlassian, which will come up a little bit later. Agenda slides are kind of fun. I just want to let you guys know kind of what we're going to talk about, and then I will get into it. So we'll talk a little bit about good docs, how crowdsourcing can help you or maybe hurt you, what you can do if you've started going down this road of managing content, some best practices from my own experience, and I will caveat that with I do not know everything and I don't have the answers, and I would love to encourage discussion about this. And I'll end with a little bit of a case study. So, last week when I was double checking and prepping for the talk, I saw this tweet and thought, oh my gosh, this is so funny. This means no ill will toward anyone who's written a sentence like this. I know I certainly have in the past. But it's actually kind of fun because it playfully sums up sort of what happens. I work with developer documentation, and this is really a common thing that can occur. If you actually ran across documentation that was like this, it might not be super helpful because you may not understand what a bench is, right? And in case you're not familiar, this is JavaDoc is a tool that people use to write API documentation in line with Java code. So developers are often the ones writing this, and therefore sometimes they're just like, all right, this is a bench. Like, what more do you need to know? So what makes documentation good? We frequently hear complaints about poor documentation causing issues with developers being able to do their job. It's cited frequently in Stack Overflow surveys and other things like that. I've also surveyed our internal developers at Atlassian, and I get the same sort of response. But what makes things good? Is it how well written documentation is? Is it how pretty the documentation is? Is it something that's engaging? Or is it just dry, accurate information? If you were to ask a technical writer, they might articulate a bulleted list that sounds something like this. Good documentation is informative, accurate, discoverable, concise, and well-structured. That's probably what I would tell you if you wanted a short answer. However, it's not something that you necessarily read because you love it, right? And so if you probably can't see it, but that guy's actually, or whoever's reading that, has the Watchmen novel right there too, but they're reading a technical piece. It's not something that you read just for fun, typically. So usually, what we learn when we're trained as technical writers is that people do things in the context of a task. And I took this picture at the Air and Space Museum. Those are actually Neil Armstrong's gloves. And what you can see is the little bits of writing there. That's actually some form of checklist or instructions that say, do EVA, take 2 pictures, and things like that. And so this is sort of like when you're in high school and you write something on the palm of your hand so you don't forget it later. Going to the moon was a big deal, and you needed to get everything right. So here we have the little cheat sheet that you took with them. So keep in mind that people are using whatever you write when they're doing something. So as technical writers, our goal is to deliver the right kind of content at the right time and in the right context, whether or not it's on a glove or built into the UI. It sounds really, really simple, but this is something that can be really, really difficult to do in practice. Before you define what the right thing is, you have to understand who's doing it and why they're using it. And I'm going to repeat that a few times as we go through this. Next, you get to work with the product team to ensure that the content you're creating is both accurate and reflects what the product actually does, because sometimes the designs may not be how it actually gets implemented. And finally, you have to ensure that you are able to put the content in the appropriate place. That may mean building it into the product, placing it in a documentation site, and also doing testing to ensure that things are being revealed where they need to be. So this is super complicated to do when you have dedicated technical writers involved and designers. If you start introducing crowdsourcing, it becomes even harder. So let's get into the meat of this talk. Crowdsourcing. What is it? When I started doing crowdsourcing, it was inadvertent, and I sort of found myself in the middle of it. So I'm not trained in this, I'm not an expert, but one thing I started realizing was that the words crowdsourcing and open sourcing are often talked about kind of as the same thing. I'm not a member of open sourcing communities. I work mostly at enterprise software places. So sometimes when you say the word open sourcing, or the term open sourcing, people start saying, no, we can't do that, our stuff is licensed. So just for the sake of argument, so that we're clear, I took these definitions from Simon Phipps, who's involved with the open source initiative and used to work managing things at Sun. And he basically says that the difference is really the ownership of the outcome and also the expectations of the people who are doing it. So open sourcing tends to be more of a community effort where people are equal peers, while crowdsourcing tends to be something where people volunteer time. Now, if you feel strongly about this, I'd love to know more, but for the sake of this talk, I just want to say that crowdsourcing is something that you can often use as a way of describing getting more people involved versus this open sourcing thing, which can get into this whole licensing debate. Anyway, either way, you have to spend time developing either approach. So if we apply this idea to content, we have this definition saying crowdsourcing is a content development approach that relies on people volunteering their time to create content. And crowdsourcing is a hot topic right now. I know it's been talked about on the podcast quite a bit recently. And it's something that is a good option when you have maybe a chance to supplement content, particularly at a company, when you have an identified pool of potential volunteers who are willing to help and who are bought into the process. It may not be a good solution for you if you don't have buy-in from leadership, the volunteer pool doesn't want to help, and you don't have anyone managing the process, because then you wind up in a situation where it doesn't just happen by itself. Otherwise, everything would crowdsource naturally. So what are some of the advantages? In my experience, it can help you solve some specific issues. These come in the form of use cases that may not be typically documented by technical writers, say if you have support involved. In addition, you may also have the ability to unlock knowledge from different parts of your organization, support, professional services, things like that. And if your content is public, you may also get contributions back from the general public, so that can actually be quite helpful too, because they may have insight that you don't have, or find an error for you. And finally, if you have the right setup and your process is strong, you can actually help minimize bottlenecks in the publishing process when you're ready to ship some content. I know that that's something that I've actually struggled with, and this is an advantage, but this can be really tricky to do well. There are some challenges, however. Distributed responsibility comes with the territory, and this is actually kind of a problem, because what you can have is people start assuming someone else will take care of something, and that can actually mean that things don't get done, or don't get done very well. Another issue, and this is the one that the technical writers I find really struggle with, is that content over time probably will become a little bit less good. So you start introducing more kinds of content that maybe not edited as well, and your structure and technical errors start getting introduced. And that's something where you have to set your expectations properly, otherwise you will struggle with this. We'll talk a little bit about some things that you can do to mitigate that. And the final thing that's a challenge is that you start seeing a buildup of quantity of documentation. We recently restructured, I'll give you an example. We recently restructured our developer documentation at Atlassian, and for one of our products, we found that we have 5 separate developer getting started guides. 4 of them weren't working, and the 5th one sort of worked, but they all linked to one another. So this was actually something that, out of the goodness of their heart, several people had contributed these guides, but then it turns out that they were really not useful for the end users. So just building these things up over time and not retiring them because of a breakdown in the editorial process can actually be really challenging. Something else that you'll find is that crowdsourcing isn't a magic bullet solution. Sorry about the idiom. But you start seeing that you will have this 1% rule. And I think Tom Johnson wrote a blog about this earlier this year, but I also find that this tends to be true. You'll get about 1% of people who will actually be doing some form of active contribution who get really involved with it. And maybe about 9% of people who are doing a little bit less involved, but they actually do some things. So maybe they're editing content or just supplementing it. And then everyone else will just lurk or view. But if you're an optimistic glass half full person, which I try to be most of the time, you're like, woo, 10% more people are helping. But then you start realizing that's a lot more work, because now you have 10% more edits to make. So it turns out writing documentation is still hard even when you have more people helping. So let's say that you're on the path to try this for yourself, or you've found yourself in a situation like I have, which I'll explain in a second, I want to give you some advice on things that I've learned by going through this process over the last few years. So about 3 years ago, I started working at a place and realized that I wasn't a technical writer anymore, even though that was my job title. I will tell you now, if I introduce myself, I'll give you a different title every time, because I'm still kind of torn about what I do. Maybe I should just start saying documentarian. But I started evolving into a technical manager by finding out that I was actually an editor. So in the publishing industry, editors oversee publishing processes from start to finish. So this means planning and tracking documentation projects while managing the humans that are involved. And so that's a lot of work. And then I realized as I was going through this process, I had to really invest in the people who were doing the writing, because otherwise they would just sort of do whatever. And so I started thinking more about how to balance training with deliverables and how to approve a lot of changes all at once so that we could actually get things done and things could go out. And I made one really good mistake, which I'll talk about later. So now when I look at content projects, I start with different objectives, because I found myself in a role where I'm coaching teams to write content, and they may or may not have a technical writer. So when I start any process, I ask the same kinds of questions. Who are your users and what do they need? How are you doing your documentation today, if at all, and what is not working? And when you're building new things, what content are you throwing away? What content are you revising? How do you maintain your content? And so the reason that I ask these questions is because there's actually two kind of co-aligned processes going on in the software development world. One is the software development lifecycle, and so developers are really familiar with this. It kind of goes something like this. You plan, design, build, test, and ship, roughly. You may have a slightly different version of that. With documentation, you have a content lifecycle that's quite similar. You plan, you write, you review or edit or test, and then you ship. And so in an ideal situation, you can align these two processes. But often the development lifecycle doesn't allow for a slot for saying, did you do the docs? So what you really struggle with as someone with a content strategy kind of approach is how do you marry those things up and make them work well? Because I'm a pedantic technical writer, I love definitions of things, and this one comes from Anne Rockley. And you don't need to read the whole thing, but basically she defines content strategy as a repeatable method for getting stuff done. And in this case, it's doing the content development process. But the key thing here is that this is a method that you can repeat. And if you're working in a crowdsourcing situation, it also needs to be a method that you can communicate clearly and easily to people, or they will just look at it and say, this is too complicated, I didn't ask for this role, please, I'm not doing this. So, let's get into the part about the best practices. So these are some of the things that I've learned that have helped me, and hopefully can help you a little bit. The main thing that I want to share is that you should build some form of writing toolkit or set of instructions. And there are resources online that you can use, right? The Docs is working on part of this, but there are also things that will be specific to your company that you should do for yourself. And so the first thing is just these simple instructions. How do you get set up to write documentation at this place? How do you publish something? Where do you check it in if you're using Git? Or where do you log into the content management system? Those types of things, if you're working on a globally distributed team, can save you emails at midnight when someone can't ship something and you get put on call to come fix some docs process. The other thing that's really important is some sort of a style guide. And style guide is a really broad term for a bunch of different kinds of things that can range from brand and typography of your brand and your visuals, all the way to English usage. Someone earlier was presenting about the Microsoft Manual of Style. That is a style guide just the same as our Atlassian design guidelines that cover how does our brand look, which blue do we use, things like that. Those are really, really important, and you will be surprised at how much, as people start getting practice with doing technical writing, they'll actually start looking at these more and more. And finally, guidelines. I sometimes call these best practices, but basically you need to have some sort of way of describing what your process is and all of the templates and things that you use, including review checklists, which I'll talk about more in a minute. This will actually guide people on what you expect from the documentation. And because I don't like scaring away people who have never written documentation before, I try to break this down into like 3 simple rules. Write for your user, write consistently, and do the docs or it isn't done. And so I'll walk through each of these in a little bit more detail. So writing for the user. I primarily work with developers, and they're very close to the products that they make, and they often understand them in a way that other people don't, because they're very close to the logic and the flow and everything like that, and they spend all their day looking at it. Users may not do that, and so one of the things that I try to reinforce with the people that I help is that they really need to start thinking outside of their domain. And one of the things that I try to say is you have an audience of people who are both using the product and maybe reading about it because they need to do something, they're confused, or they're in the middle of a complex task. So keep in mind that your audience may be a different kind of person than you. So say you are developing a product that bankers use that are not the most technical people. And one of the exercises that I give them to start thinking about this is this 5 W's exercise. So these are pretty straightforward questions. Who uses your product? What are they doing when they use your product? Are they doing something in the context of some other thing? Are they using your product because they're frustrated and they need to file some sort of an issue with, say, an insurance company? And then why are they using it? Is this something that is optional for them to use? Or like I said before, is it part of a business process? Also important is when they're using it. Is this something they do on a daily basis, or is this something that maybe they have some other related software and then you wind up in a different program and that's where your piece comes in? And finally, where do your users interact with these things? I've written documentation that sort of spans from API all the way down to handheld PDF printouts. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that, like Neil Armstrong's gloves, you may need to use this on the moon. Maybe. Writing consistently is also a really important thing. And for people who don't write very often, I try to eliminate as many barriers as possible. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time on is building templates, at least early in the process. So I'm going to say this horribly. This is Gaudi's church in Barcelona. I apologize, I'm not even going to try. But basically, this is really interesting because each of the columns that are in this building follow a basic template. However, at different points in the building, they have to do different things. So structurally, they're all quite similar. And when you look at them, they all kind of follow the same basic thing. But if you look closely, you'll notice that they're all a little different. And that's okay. And this is why we have templates. It's okay to encourage people to follow the template, but they may deviate a little bit each time. The templates that I give my authors will look something like this, kind of conceptually. So if you're in the content strategy world, you'll be like, this is a content type. But really, it's just a how-to guide. And so here's the structure that you use. And this is actually a component from our writing toolkit at Atlassian. Similarly, we have a similar structure because we know that readers appreciate structure that's similar when they're trying to do something for a reference template. So we have, basically, you just go in and you fill this in. It also makes your reviewing much easier because you don't have documents that are coming in that have vastly different structures. And finally, the docs or it isn't done part. So this is the part at the beginning where I was saying, how do you maintain your documentation? What I'm really wanting them to start thinking about is how can I do the documentation when I'm building something? And so what I do here is really start trying to get that into the process. And one of the other things is to create a series of basically like procedural checklists. And these are just some examples that I'll go through a little quickly here, but you can look at the slides later. So for the planning phase, I may have some specific things that you cover every time. Are we documenting a new feature? How do you update tutorials? Is there anything to be retired? During the writing phase, I'll give the authors a checklist that includes spell check. That is often overlooked, particularly if you're using tools that don't have spell checkers built into them. But also update your screenshots, spend some time on the code examples and things like that. It just kind of helps them not have to think about what they need to do and focus on the content. Another thing that, because I work in a technical way, like a Docs like code model, I get to do things in pull requests. So with some of the tooling out there, you can actually build checklists into pull requests. And you can say, was it copy edited? Did the voice and tone meet requirements? Did code compile? Whatever's applicable to you. If you have translation, you can put things in there like that. And as bonus points, if you're actually doing QA on your documentation, this one is really the planning checklist. Did we cover all the things that we thought we needed to? followed up by, did you notice anything else? So the people who are doing the testing are not ideally the people who did the writing. And they may actually emulate a user more, and they might notice something that maybe got omitted from the planning and writing phases. So that's actually a really helpful one. You get a lot of feedback maybe before it gets to the customer. So to put all of this together, as you start going into more of a content management role, you'll find that you're, from a technical writer role at least, that you're spending more of your time in person training and coaching people. And this is to make sure that they're aware of the toolkit and the processes that you use. And for a long time, it'll seem like you do this nonstop. And another thing that you'll notice is that more of your time is spent planning than editing or doing other activities. You'll spend more time planning than you used to. And this will be because you need to try to get this process kind of ingrained in the team. And over time, that might become less involved for you, and become more involved. Kind of depends on what you're building. Finally, and I'm glad I went after the feedback person, you're going to have to learn how to give really good feedback. And as you start doing more editing, especially in pull requests, you can be quite direct about things without being rude about them, so you may repeat things. And I've actually found that a lot of people really appreciate getting their writing reviewed, because a lot of the people that I work with aren't technical writers first, nor do they want to become a technical writer. And I've surveyed our Atlassian developers about this, and there's a lot of anxiety about writing for a lot of reasons. Most people feel concerned because they're not good at writing. They may have English as a second language, so they're really concerned they might not communicate well. And they may also just get really confused about what they need to do, even with all of the help that you've given them, because they're not going to read all of the writing toolkit before they get started. So being able to give that kind of feedback and coaching and training is really, really helpful. So I want to end by going through an example of basically a case study of how this worked well at a company where I used to work. So I was a lone technical writer on a team of about 100 product managers and engineers, and I was busy. And one day, a support engineer who reported up through a different chain at my company walked up to me and said, "Hey, I need you to help me do some stuff with documentation. Can you teach me how?" I was like, I'm not supposed to say yes, but sure. I have spare time. So basically, we talked a little bit. My manager was not thrilled with this. We talked a little bit, and he was telling me how their team was growing. They had this knowledge base that they wanted to kind of assemble, and they didn't have any shared knowledge in their team. And basically, the goal was to be able to scale the team and reduce customer frustration, reduce call volume, and a bunch of other noble things. So, as I already said, they landed on this idea that they were going to build a knowledge base, which needed to be versioned. The content that I worked with at that company was heavily versioned, so it needed to be versionable in line with the documentation. And they were going to put this in this support portal, which is where the documentation lived. So I tried to help as much as I could. I basically shoved the writing toolkit at him and said, this is what I can do for you now. Email me or chat with me if you have some questions. And then he left. And so I was happy because we had a release. So what wound up happening, basically the support team went away, they did some planning. They defined their requirements. I helped them a little bit with the information architecture so that they could structure this in a way that would actually be meaningful for them to use. They created some templates for the knowledge base articles based on some of the types that they found in their notes, and they developed some content processes. What was really cool was one day I walked into the kitchen at lunchtime, and it was taken over by the support team, and they actually had my style guide and instructions and slides, and they were going through them one by one. They were all asking questions, and they were training themselves based on the writing toolkit, which was, by the way, never happens, but I was really excited about because I was like, awesome. And so they did that. And over the course of about 2 months, they actually built and implemented this, and then I quit. So I came back about 15 months later and talked to basically the guy who started this whole process and said, okay, well, what did you guys do and how did this work out for you? And so 15 months later, they launched, by the way, with about 50, I think, or 60 articles. They had over 300 articles written. They were all up to date. There may be a few that needed to be retired. And they actually kept having this steady flow of updated articles. And so that sounded really great. One of the things that they learned, however, was that they had this workflow and tooling that they borrowed from engineering that really didn't work for them. Git was too much. They weren't able to keep track of that with the frequency they needed to do things. So they identified that their workflow was just too different, and they implemented a different tool to manage their content, which I thought was actually quite nice because they were still able to keep that version control. And then they migrated everything. And so what wound up happening was that little bridge that I kind of inadvertently started building with them was this cross-departmental collaboration started happening. And so they built a really strong relationship with the engineering department, who now contributes to the knowledge base with articles and helps them maintain it. And this wouldn't have happened if they hadn't had that initial conversation with me and if I hadn't said yes. Or maybe it would have, but it would have taken a very different form. And so what they're able to do now is actually keep all these things up to date, and customers can find these articles, and it's been really great for them. And it's actually public now too, so that's really cool. So in closing, what I would like to say is that you should take time to empower your writers when you have a volunteer audience and reward their successes. As somebody said earlier, talk, 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 talk. Make sure that you're able to say, hey, look, this thing we built, it's providing value. We've saved this amount of call volume. It actually goes a really long way to help reinforcing the idea that content is part of what you're building as a team. So thank you.